أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum all, and thank you all for joining us. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Amaarah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So I'd like to introduce you to our members. I have Dr. Amaarah DeCuir with me, who is an educational leadership scholar. Her work, broadly speaking, focuses on the intersections of leadership, gender, and diverse cultural contexts to advance social justice. Her most recent work is centered on the roles and responsibility of women leading American Islamic schools. Today, she's exploring the applications of culturally responsive pedagogies and leadership in public schools that serve Muslim American students. She is a professorial lecturer in the School of Education at University in Washington, D.C. Our theme tonight is on women leading Islamic schools, so we'll get started, inshallah. My first question is, why the topic women leading American Islamic schools, and what was the impetus?
Okay, thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let me first begin by just thanking this organization and this Facebook group of Islamic School Educators from what looks like literally around the world. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk and share this research. And it means something more to me when I can share this research to a group of people that are already committed and interested and engaged in the field of Islamic education, because they engage in the discussion with me in a very different way than when I'm presenting this work to a general audience that is simply curious about American Islamic schools and women in positions of leadership within those schools. I began my study in higher education in an education leadership program, and I knew that I wanted to study some contribution of American Islamic schools to the larger literature in higher education. But what I found very quickly was that there were a great amount of research on Catholic schools and the leadership structures in Catholic schools. There was some available research in Jewish day schools and the leadership there, but much less literature about Islamic schools and the leadership structures, and practically no research on the women leading American Islamic schools. I led an Islamic school for 7 years, and before that was a member of that school board for another 5 years. I knew in the community that most of our schools in this country are led by women, most of our Islamic schools. And it was a strong desire of mine to make sure that the voices of these women appeared in higher education literature. When we listen to stories of how American Islamic schools were founded, most stories begin with a mother who wanted something different for her children and got together with other women in the community to establish a school. Other stories may begin with a masjid that makes a decision that they want to have a school, and they call on some of the women in the community to establish the school. So women are at the center of most of the origin stories of American Islamic schools. So it made sense that their stories be captured. That's one of the reasons why when I began my research, I knew I wanted to do a qualitative study to simply listen to these women describe what are their experiences in leadership within their schools, and how do they begin to make sense of their experiences in their schools. So I ended up conducting a national study. We have women in the study who appear from the Midwest, from the South, from the Northeast, from some of the more established Islamic schools, from some very new Islamic schools, trying to get a wide range of voices to appear in this work. And what I ended up finding was that the experiences that I had in my own school were not unique. They were mirrored and replicated by women across the country. We had not met each other. We had not collaborated beforehand, but in listening to one another's stories, and when you see when you see my work laid out in writing, you begin to see there are some strong patterns that exist among these women, and I wanted to capture those. So I can introduce you to the study's findings by describing a couple of things that I began to see.
Okay, good. That was my next question. So, yeah. What did you notice?
So one, the first questions that I asked were about their roles and responsibilities. And there was one participant in the study who gave a great description that when she was going to graduate school in the field of education leadership, she was told by her faculty members that they needed to learn about different jobs, like how to manage the school accountant, how to manage the counseling office, how to manage the class.
I'm going to ask the audience, can you view Sister Amaarah? Or am I the only one that can't? Okay, Bismillah. Thank you for joining us again. So I have Dr. Amaarah DeCuir with me, an educational leadership scholar. We did initially start with our interview, and Sister, you spoke about why the topic, your experiences, and the fact that you've met so many women across the country who have shared very similar experiences to you, and their story, haven't been shared, and you wanted to make sure that our stories were heard. So we'll continue on with your research findings and your key takeaways from what you've discovered.
Very good. Thank you. Bismillah. So one, these women were very committed to continuing their own graduate studies to become familiar with the practices of education leadership. Many of these women began their role as a leader in a non-leadership position at their school. There were stories of women that began as a substitute teacher and then a classroom teacher, and then they were selected by the school board to lead the school. There was another story of a woman who was a very active parent at the school and then was tapped to become the next leader for the school. So these women came into their positions of leadership in various ways, but once in that seat of being the school principal or the school assistant principal, they took it upon themselves to continue their education in the field of education or education leadership. And one of the women was mentioning that when she was in her higher education studies, the professors would talk about the role of a school leader is to supervise the accountant, supervise the counseling office, supervise, let's say, the facility staff. And the leader went back to her school almost chuckling, saying, at our school, we don't have these different departments. I am all of these different departments. And in fact, I'm pulling up a quote from one of the participants who named herself Samaya. She said, but not so in here. It becomes your responsibility in the sense that there's multiple roles that we have to play because we don't have designated people for all those different roles to play with. Female Islamic school leaders often assume each of the roles in the school. They talked about answering the telephone when the receptionist isn't there. They talked about serving as a substitute teacher when a classroom teacher calls in sick. They even talked about being the school counselor when the school wasn't able to afford an official counselor. So one, there were lots of sharing of stories of this multiplicity of roles. The second thing that I would mention is that, and this ties into the poll that you were just describing to me from the site before my talk.
Yeah. So I'll just quickly
equitable.
Yes. So there was a question posted up earlier. I think I had posted it yesterday or the day before in regards to if women are treated equitable in Islamic school environments. And it's almost neck and neck. I mean, there was a certain point where it was 50-50. I think at the moment it's 12 members who have said no and 8 who have responded yes. And even the responses, some people were sitting on the fence, some were quite confused, whereas others were able to link their experiences as to why they believe that it isn't equitable. Did you want to build on that?
I'll weigh in on the poll. So I'm on the side with the people who say it is not an equitable relationship, that Muslim women in positions of leadership in the schools, they are not experiencing their leadership equitably. And some of the stories that I can share to back up my evidence as to why I would state this fall under the category of what you might call microaggressions. And in our community, we often don't speak about gendered microaggressions. Women in our Muslim community recognize that there are members of our community that will treat us differently because we are women, that will treat us differently because we are mothers, that will treat us differently because of our age, or sometimes treat us differently because of the color of our skin. And unfortunately, because this is a practice that is repeated by different individuals within the Muslim community, men and women begin to accept this as just the way it is. There may be an understanding that this is not Islamic, but we simply shrug our shoulders and say, well, this is just the way it is. When you listen to the women tell stories about how they interacted with their school board, you begin to hear stories that tell you this is not the way it should be, and this is not equitable. So an example, I'll tell a story from one of the participants. She said she had to check all of the time and get permission for things that a lot of the principals have to deal with an issue 4 or 5 times, because they deal with it when they are making a decision. Then they have to explain their decision to a school board member, and then they have to tell it to another school board member, and then the school board has to discuss it over, and then discuss and argue with the principal as to how she made this decision, and then they may give her the permission to go ahead and enact what it is she was deciding. Are you able to still hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm shocked, but continue, please.
And they describe having to go back and forth to get their own thoughts and ideas approved. Another woman told a story of coming into a job interview for a position of leadership, and the school board asked her to bring her husband and asked her in the context of the interview, who is going to cook dinner and tend to your children if you take this position as a leader? These are just some of the stories that express the fact that women, when they are in the highest positions of leadership at the school, there are still forces that are creating gendered injustices towards their leadership role.
Yeah.
That led me to then doing a study with a colleague of mine from Howard University. Her name is Dina Khalil. And we took my findings and re-evaluated the results from a lens of Islamic feminism. And Islamic feminism, for those that are less familiar with the term, is a way of critically evaluating the experiences of women to hear stories of injustice and resistance that are coming from their stories and their voices. So when looking at the women leading American Islamic schools and framing their responses under a lens of Islamic feminism, what you do see is that these women are leading in a model that is equitable. They are taking all of the injustices that may be thrown on them for their gender, and they are turning it around to create school communities that are led with equity in mind. And I know this because they talk about leading with shura. Constantly, they're mentioning that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is their leadership model, and that they delegate, they collaborate, they consult with a wide range of people in their school community to make equitable decisions. They talk about bringing in a smile and a hug to greet children when they come into school. They talk about greeting their colleagues with a smile and an attention to their personal lives, asking them, how is your pregnancy going? Or how are your children doing? Or how is your commute this day? Creating an environment that feels like what they would describe as a model prophetic community.
Inshallah.
This was very powerful because you don't see this same commitment to leading with equity in the face of injustice when you look at other faith-based school communities.
Okay.
And then the last thing that I'll mention is these women were leading their schools as sites of resistance against anti-Muslim sentiment that is all around our communities. So you'll find them inspiring the children to engage in civic work. You'll find them, those women speaking in public settings where they stand up in front of a public crowd, sometimes wearing their hijab, speaking with clarity and conviction about the importance of education in their community. These are all ways that they are challenging the stereotypes of an oppressed, submissive Muslim woman, and they are challenging it by standing up straight with conviction and strength and confronting these negative sentiments that are in and around their daily experiences. So I found power and excitement and strength in these women as I was listening to their stories.
I'm sure all of us would love to hear so many more examples that you could possibly share with us in the future, because it's just quite inspiring. Somebody had posted up saying, yes, Amaarah, many school leaders never expected to run the school according to anyone's standard other than their own. It is often expected that women are less and will be a figurehead and nothing more. So, mashallah, thank you for sharing these stories with us that are quite empowering, and we hope to hear a lot more. What advice would you give Islamic schools based on your findings?
The first advice that I would give to an Islamic school that has a woman in a position of leadership, or they are considering placing a woman in a position of leadership, is to move forward and allow her to lead, to be confident that her experiences, whether they come from a typical pattern of stepping through an education career, or whether they are more circuitous and they come from a unique path that landed her in a position to assume a school leadership role, let her lead. Create space for her to make decisions, because the research is very clear that women lead from a position of wanting the best for the next generation of Muslim young people. And that passion is going to be coupled with excellent decision-making when they have the support and the resources necessary to do the work of that school community. So to give her space to lead and to provide the resources for her to continue her education. Many of the women are working on very low salaries, and they're using their money not just to help care for their family, but to fund their continued studies. There are women earning a second master's degree, or some that are trying to earn their doctorate degree. And if schools and school boards and masjid communities could invest in the continued education of their female leaders, they will reap benefits beyond what small monetary contributions they put in. And then the last is, many of the women, their leadership roles are limited by lack of consistent babysitting and support for household affairs. So find people in the community that can offer childcare, that can offer housekeeping, that will bring back the notion of preparing dinner for the leader as just a gift and an acknowledgement of a token of appreciation. Those small things mean so much to a woman in a position of leadership, because it allows her to focus on the school during the day and then to come home and focus on her family in the evening. And when women feel that they have a balance, they're more able to succeed in their work.
Yes, I think a lot of us women who are resonate with a lot of things in terms of being very supportive
Yes.
With each other, inshallah. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experiences. And we definitely need to hear more of these stories amongst our own communities, because even though I'm in Australia, so many people come to mind when you share your stories with the women that you know, subhanAllah, and we don't hear of them aloud. So we do need to bring them out into the surface.
Yes.
Yes, for our benefit of our children.
Absolutely.
Ultimately.
Absolutely. Little girls and little boys need to know the stories of our leaders, our real heroes in our community today, because they're doing very powerful things in our schools.
Inshallah. And I know you'll be sharing with us a couple of articles, inshallah, throughout the week.
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit about those articles?
Yes. So one is going to be an article that describes the roles and the responsibilities of women leading schools. It helps to document the great work that's going on in the schools. A second article is going to take this work and look from a feminist lens and describe how school leaders are using their roles to confront injustices and create equitable community spaces. And then at some point in the near future, I have a book chapter coming out on emotionality, which is essentially how do you make sense of the emotions that women exhibit in positions of leadership within our Muslim American schools.
Sounds very interesting. May Allah preserve you and reward you for all your hard efforts. Thank you so much for joining us.
This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for making this technologically easy and very engaging. Thank you.
The conversation will be continuing within our posts, inshallah. So when you do, or if you do get the time, please join us with those posts. But we'll definitely keep this conversation going and hope to speak to you in the near future. And we are looking forward to the articles. Thank you so much.
Inshallah. Thank you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum.